She woke before dawn in the thin room that smelled of cold metal and damp concrete, and glanced at the clock on the wall that ticked in its steady rhythm. She swung her legs over the edge of the bunk and felt the mattress shift beneath her weight. Then she pulled on the regulation issue. Boots, heavy leather and steel that felt like anchors on her ankles, but she put them on anyway. She had learned that every morning was a new battle, even if the uniforms were the same, even if the formation, lines were identical, and the orders unchanged. She stepped into the hallway where the echo of distant footsteps had already begun a soft drum of cadence, and she moved with it, though her heart hammered in her chest because she was the smallest in the platoon, and her shoulders were narrow and the gear weighed more than she thought it should still. She marched toward the mess hall with a rigid posture that felt wrong in her bones. She took her tray of eggs and grits, though she never actually liked grits, and sat at the corner table so no one would sit with her. No one would try to hide their laughter, but she could hear the whispers rising like heat from the floorboards. They called her the shortest, the slowest, the one who paused and panted when the rest sprinted or lunged through obstacle after obstacle. She heard their chuckles and felt them as though they were needles on her skin. The training instructor barked orders at the group, and no one shirked. But when they moved out, to the field, and the rain came and the mud pooled like ink in the boot prints, she still managed to keep up until the first climb, the rope that hung from the beams high above the clearing. She stared up at the glistening rope and reached for it. With both hands, though, the wet twisted her fingers and her palms slipped. She had practiced this rope climb once in civilian life, and she knew the sting of adrenaline and the ache in her arms. She wrapped her legs around the rope and pulled herself upward inch by inch, and the other soldiers dropped into place beside her and hoisted themselves up with powerful swings of their hips and arms. She paused mid-ascent to catch her breath, and the group halted behind her. She thought she would hear more mocking from the grunt of effort that escaped her lips, but instead there was silence except for the rain and the slap of boots on soggy ground. Her chest rose and fell, and she glanced at the wooden beam above, and then she pulled with everything she had and latched onto the beam with her fists and swung one leg over. She hit the platform and looked down at the group below, her uniform drenched dark and plastered to her form, her hair matted to her neck. She heard the instructor call out, "Move on! Move on!" And the rest of the soldiers scattered across the clearing like insects when a light came on them. She climbed down the platform off the rope and landed heavily with a sound that made the others glance her way. She kept going, though. Every muscle in her body fired protest. There was the tire drag, the weighted sled push. There was the obstacle course where beams and barrels and rising walls grew like sudden cliffs in front of her, and she navigated each one by grit and sheer will. She could smell the earth mixed with rubber and sweat, and the bark of the instructor's voice cut through the air like a whip, and behind that voice she heard the laughter. She felt it most when she paused in the endurance run because her lungs burned, and the air in the forest seemed thicker and the path darker, and the group turned around and looked back, and she heard someone chuckle, someone call out slowpoke or take a nap, and the mocking rose like smoke around her. She didn't answer, because she had learned early that answers were noise, and noise could weaken you. She let the darkness around her in the morning light, let the sweat soak through her shirt, and the boots bite into her ankles, and she pretended none of it mattered, and she kept walking and running and climbing until the day broke fully and the instructor said break time. But she didn't leave the field. She leaned against the trunk of a pine tree and bent over and put her hands on her knees and gasped for breath. The others dispersed to the tents and to the stands where they could relax their bodies and their minds, but she stayed there in the clearing among the scent of pine and cold air because she still felt the pulse of something in her veins that told her to keep going, to stay in this place, until she found the moment where she paused. The instructor put a hand on her shoulder and asked if she was okay, and she nodded and wiped a trickle of blood from a small gash on her forearm where the rope had shredded her skin. She didn't mention the gash later, nor did she mention the pain, because again, she learned early that pain was a story that others might use against you. She got up and followed the others to the tents, and drank water from the canteen and sat at the mess tables with the group, but held herself apart. She listened as the others joked about the climb and how easy it was, how they'd flown over that rope like monkeys or cheetahs or something. They picked the words carefully so everyone could hear. She smiled faintly, but inside, she burned. She had a memory from years earlier, from the hills near her home, where her father had called her daughter and asked her to run with him to the crest of the ridge. And she had kept up for a while until her lungs screamed and she slowed and he didn't laugh. He waited for her. And then he carried the pack and told her that life asks you to carry what you can't yet see. You carry your fear, your doubt, your lazy thoughts, your small failures, until one day you drag them behind you to the crest and you let them slip into nothing, and you become the one who carries, not the one who is carried. She thought about that memory now as she watched. The others leave the table laughing, and the mocking glances that followed her as she walked away. She didn't know when the instructors had begun to notice her small pauses in the runs, but they did now, and when the endurance test was announced, she felt their eyes on her. She lined up with the rest of the platoon, and she waited for the command, and the instructor barked, "Go!" And they all surged forward like a wave crashing into shore, and she pushed hard. She felt the wind in her face, the freedom of motion, the ache in her muscles. She passed several of them, and then a wall rose ahead of her, and the group slowed, and she moved to the first climb and hoisted herself over. She paused on the other side and took a moment to look at the ground because her boots plunged into mud and she could feel the cold wetness seeping up, and a stranger voice behind her murmured, "You're lagging," and she ignored it. Then she kept running. The field turned into forest again, the tree trunks close, and the path narrow, and she could hear the laughter behind her again, the whisper, "Slowpoke, slowpoke." She gripped her jaw and let it go. She ran harder. She scrambled up a fallen log. She jumped down and landed awkwardly, and her ankle twisted slightly, and a hot spike of pain detonated in her leg. She bit back a cry. She forced herself upright. She kept running through the narrow trail. The rain came back, and the forest shook leaves and branches, and her uniform clung to her body like a second skin. And then the path opened into a clearing, and the sleds were waiting, heavy metal sleds strapped to ropes and pulleys, and she could hear the grunts as each soldier fought the weight of the sled, and she approached hers and hooked the harness over her shoulders. She paused for a moment. She bent down to tighten the straps. She felt their eyes on her. She could almost taste their smirks. She straightened and looked at the sled and then pulled. She dragged the weight across the wet ground. She stumbled a few steps, and the sled groaned with movement, and the others passed her easily. But she kept going. She thought of her father, of the ridge, of the pack of doubts she had carried, and she turned that memory into motion. She pulled, and the sled slid across the dirt, and the rain washed small streams around her boots, and she heard the world quiet, except the grind of metal, the dripping of rain, and her breathing. She felt something shift inside her like a broken gear, realigning. Moved faster then, and the mocking voices fell away, or they were drowned by her own pulse and her own heart. And when the instructor yelled change direction, she pivoted the sled and raced back the opposite way, and the others looked at her and something passed their eyes, and she didn't care. She kept dragging until the instructor said stop, and she let her shoulders collapse. Though she stayed upright, and the rain pounded, and the forest seemed to breathe relief with her, and she whispered a silent promise to herself that the next time they mocked her, they would witness something they couldn't ignore. She didn't know what that something would be yet, but she felt it pulse like electricity through her veins. She stood in the clearing and watched the other soldiers walk past her chatting and smiling, and she waited and glanced at the horizon as the clouds broke and light filtered through, and she recognized in that light a promise that the day wasn't over, that what awaited the rest of the test was still ahead, and she would be ready to surprise them. She breathed in the cold air and let it fill her lungs, and as she exhaled, she felt the ground shift beneath her boots, and she knew that the moment for her pause, and then, her thrust was coming soon, and the others will remember the day they mocked the girl who paused. The sky cracked open with the sound of something no one had expected. Not here, not during training, not in the middle of routine drills where the forest was supposed to be quiet, where danger was only ever pretend they had been laughing seconds earlier when the instructors yelled, "Move out double time," and boots slapped wet earth in quick rhythm. But then the ground shuddered, and a plume of smoke rose from beyond the ridge, and all laughter stopped as if someone had turned off the sound of the world itself. She froze in mid-stride, heart punching against her ribs as eyes darted to one another. Searching for explanation, was it part of the simulation? No one was sure. But then the radios lit up with static and shouting, and the squad leader barked for everyone to fall back, regroup, get eyes on head count. And she turned her head and saw him, the staff sergeant, a mountain of a man who had always led from the front, his voice deep and unshakable, his presence intimidating. Until now, when he lay crumpled near the base of a fallen tree, his leg twisted at an angle that looked wrong and unnatural. His gear scattered like broken armor around him and blood spreading beneath his knee like ink on a map. No one moved. Not at first, they just stared as if the rules of reality had changed, and they did not know which page to turn to next. She ran toward him. Before her brain could think it through, her boots splashing through mud and brush, her breath wild in her lungs as she slid to her knees beside him and reached for his shoulders. His eyes were open and teeth clenched, and she could see. He was trying to speak, but the pain was too much, and so he just nodded once sharply, and she knew he understood and that she had to move him, but no one else stepped forward. Some shouted into radios, some looked around as if expecting a medic to emerge from the trees like a ghost, but no help came, not yet, not soon enough, and the forest was shifting around them like it too had gone on high alert. She tried to lift him first under his arms, then by dragging his vest, but he was too heavy. His full weight and gear combined into something solid and unmoving like a monument to the impossible. She paused then for a split second and felt the old doubt creep up her spine, the voices from training echoing in her memory, whispering too small, too weak, too slow. But she shoved the thoughts down and looked at his face and saw that he was still conscious, still watching her, still believing she could do something. And that belief burned brighter than any doubt ever could. She stood and unbuckled her vest and slipped her arms under his shoulders, gripping tightly. Feeling his bulk shift against her, and then she began to pull. The mud made it worse. It sucked at her boots, at his legs, at the pack that dragged behind them. She slipped once then, twice her knees hitting rock and roots, but she did not stop. Her legs burned and her spine ached, and her fingers screamed from holding too tightly, but she kept going 1 inch at a time through the underbrush, through the smoke, through the unfamiliar sound of silence that wasn't silence at all, but fear. In disguise, she heard the others calling out, but their voices were distant, or maybe she was far away from them already. Her mind tunneled into one thing, just one task: move him, get him safe. Keep going! Her boots caught on vines and her pants were torn at the knee. Her breath was coming faster now in short stabs of air, and sweat poured down her neck, mixing with the grime on her skin. But she felt him move slightly behind her, his hand clutching her arm, and she knew he was still there, still fighting with her, still holding on, even if just barely. She dragged him across uneven ground, up small hills where her feet slid backward, and she had to brace herself with trees she pulled. When her arms felt like wires ready to snap, she grunted and hissed and growled, and used the sounds of her body to drown the screams inside her mind that said stop, but she would not stop. She thought of that day in the hills years ago with her. Father thought of how she had dragged him too, how the blood on his temple had stained her shirt, how the medics had taken forever to arrive, and she had only kept going because she refused to let the world take him without a fight. And now here. She was again different hills, different man. Same fire in her chest. She did not know how far she had come, only that the forest began to thin, the trees giving way to open land, and she could see shapes ahead, tents blurred by smoke and figures moving, with purpose and radios crackling louder and voices shouting, "Medic over here." And she stumbled forward, dragging him into view as the world tilted at a strange angle. She dropped to her knees beside him and finally let go of the harness she had tied from her belt to his gear, and for a moment she simply knelt there, her eyes wide and her mouth open, trying to speak. But no words would come, just the sound of her breath breaking like waves against a cliff. She heard the medics shout and felt hands pulling her back as others rushed to him, checking vitals, lifting stretchers, and asking questions she could not answer. She had no voice left, only the memory of the weight, the mud, the pain, and the silence that had swallowed her whole then. Spit her out, still standing, but barely someone handed her water. She drank it like it was the first drink she had ever taken. Someone else put a blanket around her shoulders, though the sun was now peeking through the trees. She stared as they lifted the staff sergeant and rolled him onto a stretcher, and the look he gave her through the pain was not pity, was not gratitude. It was recognition. He saw her not as the small, slow one, not as the one who paused, not anymore. He saw her as the one who moved mountains when others froze, who did not need permission or orders, who simply acted because something inside her demanded it. And in that moment, something changed in the way others looked at her. They no longer turned away, no longer whispered. When she passed, no longer smirked when her boots were a step behind, because now they knew, and knowing changed everything. But even as she sat there, heart pounding, muscles trembling, and the sound of sirens now cutting through the forest, she knew. It was not over, not yet, because something about the explosion had felt wrong. Something about the radio, silence, the delay in help arriving, the look on the instructor's face when he spoke into the headset, then glanced at her across the clearing and narrowed his eyes. Something about it all told her that what happened out there was no accident, and she was about to find out just how deep that truth went. The forest had grown quieter since the chaos of the explosion, except for the distant crackle of radios and the rustle of leaves stirred by a thin breeze. She moved carefully with the others, but she stayed at the back, her legs still trembling from the effort of dragging the sergeant every step of the way through mud and brush her. Breaths shallow and quick as the squad pushed forward into the unknown. The instructors gathered around the command tent, their faces drawn and eyes hard. But no one said what everyone was thinking, that this was more than just a training accident. And as the medics loaded the injured sergeant onto a vehicle, the camp fell into a tense silence. The soldiers exchanged glances heavy with questions, none brave enough to speak aloud, yet she was certain that the drill was over for them, but the real test was just beginning. And when the commanding officer ordered them to stay alert, to watch, and to report anything unusual, the weight of those words settled on her like a stone pressed hard against her chest. She wondered if the others felt the same dread, or if they only saw this as another day to prove their toughness. But for her, every shadow in the woods held the memory of that shattered leg that screamed in pain, and the staff sergeant who trusted her to save him, and she would not let that trust be broken. Now the forest seemed alive with secrets. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves set her nerves on edge, but she could not let fear control her steps. Her small frame moved with surprising determination, weaving through the trees as the team followed a winding trail toward the ridge where the explosion had come from. The air smelled of smoke and something sharp and chemical, and as they approached the crater, the ground beneath them was scarred and blackened, the earth torn apart as if some giant beast had clawed through it. The other soldiers looked tense. Some whispered theories about sabotage and enemy action, but she kept her eyes on the ground, scanning for clues, something that would explain why. A training exercise had turned into something so deadly, and as the squad fanned out to search the perimeter, she noticed a faint glimmer near the base of a broken tree, a small metallic object partially buried in the dirt. She crouched and carefully dug it out a tiny transmitter, no bigger than a matchbox. But its presence there sent a shiver down her spine. She tucked it into her pocket and stood up, just as a shout rang out from the far edge of the clearing. A voice she recognized. It was one of the radio operators. He was pointing toward a fallen soldier, half hidden in the underbrush. The team rushed over, and they found a young private unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. The medics were called again, and as they tended to him, the tension grew tighter around her chest. She realized that no one was safe here, that the danger was closer than anyone wanted to admit. And when night fell and the shadows deepened, she volunteered to take the first watch, her small figure barely visible in the faint moonlight as she scanned the tree line for any sign of movement or threat. But hours passed with only the sounds of the forest breathing around her until suddenly the crack of a twig snapped her attention toward the darkness, and she caught a glimpse of something moving quickly through the trees, something unnatural and deliberate. Her heart leapt, and she whispered a warning into her radio, but the signal was weak and crackling, and the response was slow and unclear. We followed the movement deeper into the woods, the others trailing behind her reluctantly as the trail grew darker and more tangled until they reached a clearing where the moonlight revealed a makeshift camp with strange equipment scattered about wires and devices, unlike anything they had been trained to see or handle, and at the center, a figure hunched over a small device, his face obscured by shadows, but something about the stance was familiar. It sent a chill through her spine because it was not a stranger, but someone she had seen before, someone who should not have been here. And then the figure turned slowly, and the moonlight caught the glint of a cold smile. And before she could react, the man spoke in a voice low and cutting as a knife. "You were not supposed to find this place, and now there is no turning back." Her breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, the pale moonlight casting long shadows. Across his sharp features, his eyes glinting with something cold and unreadable. She tried to steady herself, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, and the cold air seemed to freeze every movement she had to remind herself to breathe, to think, to act. And as the others crept closer, the man smiled again, that cruel, slow smile, and said quietly, "You don't know what you're meddling with. This isn't just training or an accident, it's a warning." She took a cautious step forward, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would someone do this? Who are you?" But the man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device that blinked with a red light, and in that moment, a sharp click echoed through the clearing, and a sudden blast of heat knocked her off her feet. She hit the ground hard, her ears ringing and her vision blurred as the man disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only the faint smell of smoke and the burning scent of danger she struggled to. Her knees coughing and gasping for air, the others rushed to her side, their faces pale and filled with shock, but she could only think of one thing. The warning was real, and now they were caught in something far bigger than any of them had imagined. The command tent was alive with activity as the team regrouped and the medics worked frantically to treat the injured. The commanding officer paced back and forth, his face grim and drawn, and she knew the questions were coming about what had been found in the woods and why she had gone off the grid. But before anyone could speak, the radios crackled with a new message. A voice she recognized as a high-level intelligence officer came through cold and precise, saying that the explosion was part of a covert operation gone wrong, that enemy agents had infiltrated the training grounds, and that the entire base was on high alert and lockdown. Until further notice, the room seemed to shrink around her as the gravity of the situation settled. They were no longer just soldiers on a training exercise. They were targets in a real battle for survival, and she could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her small shoulders. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her tent, listening to the sounds of the camp. Tense and restless, she thought about the man in the clearing, the secret devices, the explosion, and the wounded sergeant who had trusted her with his life. She realized then that her pause in the run weeks ago had been the calm before the storm, a moment she had taken to prepare without even knowing it, a moment that gave her the strength she needed to face what was coming. The next morning dawned cold and gray, and the orders were clear. They were to secure the perimeter search for the enemy agents and protect the base at all costs. She moved with purpose despite the exhaustion that pulled at her limbs, and as the team spread out across the forest, she kept her eyes sharp and her senses alert. The woods seemed to close around them, a living maze full of secrets and shadows, and every step brought them closer to the truth or to danger. She spotted something caught in the underbrush, a torn piece of fabric that matched the uniform of the intruders, and then heard a faint noise, like a whisper carried on the wind. She motioned for the others to follow, and they moved cautiously through the thick trees toward a hidden bunker half buried beneath the earth, its entrance camouflaged. With branches and leaves, the air grew colder as they approached, and the silence was broken only by their careful footsteps. She led the team down into the darkness, the flashlight beams cutting through the black and revealing walls lined with equipment, and screens flickering with encrypted messages. The realization hit them all that this was a base within their base, a nest of spies who had been watching them. The man from the clearing stood waiting, inside his eyes gleaming with triumph as he raised a hand and said, "The game has only just begun." But before anyone could react, an explosion rocked the bunker. The walls trembled and debris rained down, and in the chaos, she grabbed the wounded sergeant and pulled him to safety, dragging him away from the collapsing tunnel. Her muscles screamed, but she refused to let go, and as the dust settled, the squad surrounded the bunker. The enemy scattered, but the cost was clear. Wounds deep and trust broken. But she had proven herself more than any test ever could, more than any mocking laughter could undermine. And as the sun rose over the battered training grounds, she looked at the faces around her and knew that from this day forward, they saw her as a soldier, not defined by size or by pause, but by the strength that never gave up. The day had started with a pause, but ended with a march. And somewhere deep inside her, she carried the truth that sometimes the smallest moments make the greatest difference, and that even when the world mocked her, she would keep moving forward no matter what came next. And as the camp settled into uneasy calm, she glanced toward the horizon, wondering what other challenges lay ahead, knowing that the real battle was far from over.